Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Irene, and I help run events here at the Strand. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor. Still run by the Bass family, still housing new and used books, and running near 400 events a year. Tonight I'm excited to have with us Daniel Oberhaus and his new book, Extraterrestrial Languages. Previously, Daniel was the news editor at Motherboard, and he's now staff writer at Wired, where he has written about such topics as staying healthy in space, biohackers, and telescopes that look like beach balls. Extraterrestrial Languages is his first book. Here to discuss Daniel's new book is Samantha Cole, a senior writer for Motherboard Vice, where she writes about selling your face to robot startups, privacy software, and the battle of mechs on eBay. Please join me in welcoming Daniel and Samantha to the Strand.
Hello, thank you all for being here. It's nice, it's a very intimate gathering, and I'm excited for it. Can you guys hear me okay, or you're right here, so it's fine?
We have to MC it like this. Yeah.
Check on the mic. Yeah, I think this is probably fine. This is mostly for the video, right? Okay, cool. As we've already established, we're here with Daniel, who's got a book coming out, and folks here have a chance to get it tonight, and it's also going to be launching next week on the 22nd officially, so you can buy it on Amazon.
Yeah, you guys are actually the first people to get it, I think. I've never seen this many copies of it, ever, so pretty neat.
Yeah. MIT doesn't send
No.
cases of books. So this is our workshop on how to speak to aliens, and that's what we're going to learn tonight, right?
Yeah, I think by the end of it, everyone here should be ready. Should you find yourself face-to-face with an ET, you'll know how to say hello.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, has anyone here made contact with an ET? I feel like that's probably a good place to start. You know, I feel like there's always one or two. Okay. Yeah. Ew.
This is a PG event. So Extraterrestrial Languages is, it's not a guide to talking to aliens per se. It's more of a guide for us as humans and how we go about the work of communicating with extraterrestrials as a concept. Am I summing that up correctly?
Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of everything. It starts with kind of a history of communication with extraterrestrial intelligences, which seems like a really recent subject, but it's something that people have really been thinking about for hundreds of years. It used to be kind of framed in the context of communicating with angels and trying to recreate a lost language of God, and then as science kind of came up through the Enlightenment, people actually started conceiving about intelligences on other planets within our solar system. We eventually realized that there's probably no intelligent life on Mars or anywhere close to us, and then we started thinking about how to communicate on far greater time and distance scales. So it starts with the history of that, and then kind of delves into the philosophy, mathematics, questions like, will aliens understand our math? And so, I think there's a lot of surprising and kind of unexpected elements of that history.
Cool. We're going to go over some of that tonight. So I just want to read some of the early expert reviews from the back of the book.
Okay.
People from SETI and linguistic experts call the book lucid and enticing.
Wow.
An exquisite reflection from a novel and exciting perspective, and could become relevant.
Could become relevant. Yes.
Which, if you put that on the back of any...
Is that your review?
No, that's on the back of your book. You can turn your books over right now and read it. I think that's on any other book that would be kind of like what, but on this, since you're writing about something that we've never done and have always dreamed of doing, which is talking to aliens, I think that's a pretty glowing review. So tell me a little bit about how the book came to be. So you were telling me earlier, it was inspired by an article that you wrote years ago, actually.
Yeah, so this book was a total accident in every sense of the word. About 3 years ago, I was really fascinated. Don't ask me how I became fascinated with this Dutch mathematician. His name is Hans Freudenthal. I'm assuming no one here has ever heard of him because even mathematicians have barely heard of this guy. but he's a really fascinating figure. And when he was working in the Netherlands in the early 20th century, he was really against this idea called new math, which, like, judging by the age of the audience, probably a lot of people here have, like, if you studied mathematics at any time during the Bush administration, like, you kind of know what this guy hated. And it was a system of education that produced students who could recite formulas but didn't really understand what the math meant. Hey, Robin. So this system, Freudenthal just absolutely hated. He wanted to develop a mathematics that was attached to kind of everyday experience. And so he was working on this in the early 20th century, and then the Nazis came to power. And so he actually got sent to a concentration camp. And then with the help of his wife, he escaped the concentration camp, went into hiding, and then started thinking about how to contact aliens because, like, I don't know what else you're going to do when you're just worried for your life every day. But he also won literary awards. Like, this guy was just a polymath. But yeah, in 1960, he wrote a book called Lingua Cosmica, and it was the first time that anyone had actually sat down and figured out how are we going to design a language that is specifically for communicating with something that we know nothing about. We know they're intelligent, but other than that, we know nothing. And so we'll probably get deeper into this later tonight. He wasn't entirely successful, but he did kind of kickstart an entire, like, field of thought that is still being actively explored today. He never lived to see his message broadcast into space, but in the early 2000s, a group of SETI researchers did use his language as the basis for two messages that are, to date, still the most scientific things we've ever sent into space. So his ideas have kind of really long-lasting consequences. And actually, if you look on the cover of the book, the symbols there are based on his language and are kind of the next generation evolution of that. And yeah, we'll probably get deeper into this later too, but what's on the cover is 1 through 10. And so, like, that's a really complicated way, it seems, to count to 10, but it actually, there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is probably the best idea we have so far for teaching aliens, like, numerals. But yeah.
I was going to ask you about the cover because most people that see the book, that's their question, is like, what is this on the cover? Because it's so, like, strange looking. I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you, like, if I held one up, could you walk me through the numerals from, like, the cosmic call?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so on the cover of the book, so this was actually broadcast into space twice, once in 1999 and once in 2003, and it was just the start of the message. And so what's happening here is these symbols here on the sides are, they're unique, and they were designed specifically for interstellar communication. And so we're basically, the idea is we're going to teach aliens how to understand these symbols. And to do that, you start on the left-hand side with an ostensive numeral system. So you'll notice the squares here go from 1 to 2 to 3, all the way down to 10. Then this is actually an equal sign. And in the middle, you have the binary representation of 0, another equal sign, and then the symbol for 0. And so the idea is that by showing first an ostensive representation of a numeral, just one square, then they would be able to recognize binary and then eventually recognize the symbol 1. And then once you have a symbolic framework for numerals, you can begin to start discussing much more complex ideas, such as facts of basic science. And if these the two guys who designed this, Stéphane Dumas and Yvonne Dutil, if they're successful, you can theoretically talk about very complex facts of human life just from this very, very simple primer. And it's really amazing what they've done. But personally, I think, I think, despite the title of this book, I don't think we need to create a special language for extraterrestrials. I actually think sending large amounts of natural language text is probably our best way of communicating with aliens. And we can also, I think we're going to talk about.
Ahead.
Yeah, we're going to talk about AI
No
later.
spoilers.
So yeah, it's a pretty cool subject.
Before we get into all that, I want to ask where the interest for this came from and why you think it's an important area of study, because it's not something that, like, you've studied a ton in the past before beginning this book, but obviously you've been completely embedded in it for the last 2 years. So why did you first become interested in this topic, and why do you think it's important just for science in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard not to be interested in the idea of extraterrestrial life out there in the universe. Like, I think if anyone spent time looking at the stars, you probably, like, the thoughts cross your mind that you might not be alone, and there might be someone else looking back at you. And I think the idea of, like, not only knowing that you're not alone, but, like, that's a great start. It would be amazing if we just got a signal and it's like, wow, we know that there's something intelligent out there, but that's just kind of the beginning. And so the next question then, to me, in my mind, is, well, how do you say anything meaningful to this person? What do they think about? What is their day-to-day life like? Do they also have to show up and go to a job, or are they just like some machine that just sits and thinks about philosophy all day? I mean, that's, yeah, that's like my perfect life, yeah. But yeah, so I mean, it kind of came from just a very natural curiosity about extraterrestrial life, and I'd read a lot by like Carl Sagan and like these kind of progenitors of this topic, but there wasn't really a book that explored the linguistic side of it, and so I mean, I wanted to be the one to kind of really delve into this subject, especially given what's happened in linguistics in the past 50 years. Like, the first time that Frank Drake looked at a star with the intention of looking for an alien signal was in 1960, and since then we've done dozens of other SETI searches. We haven't found anything, obviously, but at the same time as that was happening, thanks to Noam Chomsky, the field of linguistics was just undergoing this huge revolution in terms of how we understand human language and how it interacts with the brain. And very few people have actually made the connection between these two fields of research, but I think they have really deep and important connections in terms of how we think about how to communicate with an extraterrestrial. Maybe now is actually a good time to talk a little bit about that to kind of form the basis for this. So natural language, what we know from studying the human brain and like MRI machines and actually seeing how it's functioning, a lot of people tend to think of language as software that's kind of implemented on a hardware base, so it's just like running a computer program. But what MRIs have actually shown us is that language is actually more of an expression of the hardware itself. So our language is deeply related to our physiology, and that to me has really profound implications for how we think about ETI, because...
Wait, define ETI.
Extraterrestrial intelligence.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and the reason for that is because if our language is like deeply connected to the structure of our brains, that means that we can't really think outside of it. And so this book opens with an epigraph from Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I like it. I think it's a little bit funny because it's in German, so if you don't speak German, you're not going to understand it. But what the quote means is, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And so there's like a few like layers of just like dumb philosophy humor here, but like the idea that you can't think what's beyond language is very important when we're thinking about talking to extraterrestrials, because if they don't have a language that is implemented on a functionally equivalent biological substrate like a brain, we probably won't be able to communicate with them. We'll have to study their language almost like we would study physics or something. We would discover things about their language rather than interpret it. And so this isn't really something that's discussed often within SETI when they are constructing messages. You just kind of begin with, okay, they're intelligent, so they probably understand math. They must have built a radio receiver if they're going to receive this, so they'll understand. But that's not necessarily the case. You can have mathematics without language, as far as we know. There's been a lot less research done on the connection between our physical, brain matter and how we interpret mathematics. It's a very active debate within that community. So, I guess that's a really long way of saying that, there's been a lot happening in the last 50 years in this field, but no one is really focused on language. And so that's what got me interested and what really made me want to dive down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, so that's kind of a nice segue into just kind of backing up and talking about the earliest efforts, because you mentioned earlier that people saw it as like communicating with angels or communicating with a higher power and not necessarily like ET. Tell me more about some of the earliest efforts to communicate with extraterrestrial life forms. And I know there was some pretty wacky ones.
Oh, yeah, they're wild.
Involving nukes
They're
and
insane.
cats, not together, but separately. So tell me, like we all know about like Voyager and the Voyager record.
Yeah.
Most people have heard of SETI. Let's go back even further than that when people were really talking about like crazy ideas to make a signal to talk to aliens.
Yeah, so I mean, the first kind of recorded ideas for this date back to the mid-19th century in Europe. There's a guy named Carl Friedrich Gauss. If you've ever had to take, higher mathematics in high school, you can thank him for all of your long nights in front of a textbook. This guy just ruined a lot of people's lives. But he was very interested in aliens. He thought they lived on the moon, and he really wanted to talk to them. And so his brilliant idea, this guy who just like created so much of modern mathematics, he was like, yeah, we're gonna plant a lot of trees in the shape of a triangle, and that's it actually. That's it. Yeah, he's like, we're gonna build a giant proof of the Pythagorean theorem made out of trees and wheat in the Siberian tundra, and like we'll see what happens. And like it never took off. Obviously, it was a terrible idea.
Did they even plant the trees, or did like?
No, I think most people even then were like, this is like, Carl, what do you No. But like it gets worse than that actually, because he influenced a guy, an Austrian astronomer named Joseph Johann von Littrow. And his brilliant idea was, let's not build them out of trees. Let's dig giant trenches in the Saharan desert, fill them with water, top them with kerosene, and then light them on fire every single night and just create giant flaming messages in the desert. And everyone was like, yeah, Johann, that's great. Like, no, we're not going to do that. So that was kind of how SETI existed for about 20 years in the mid-19th century. And then in Paris, like, I don't know what happened, but there was just like a weird 20-year period where there was a lot of really interesting scientists exploring really crazy ideas, and a lot of them were also really interested in communicating with extraterrestrials. And there was this one guy whose name is actually escaping me right now. It's in the book if you happen to read it. But he believed that like when you die, your soul jumps from planet to planet just kind of infinitely. And he wanted to just coat the Eiffel Tower, which I think is like probably the tallest thing most Parisians had ever seen. They're like, yeah, this is as good as it gets. And just like coat it with mirrors and flash messages towards Mars. And then one of his colleagues was like, you know what, a better idea would be like, we could just build one giant mirror and burn messages onto the surface of Mars. And it's like, like being on the receiving side of that, if you were just to like all of a sudden there's just like a giant like magnifying glass on your planet just like writing hello, it's like not a great way to start. And so that's kind of how things progressed until about the turn of the 20th century, when Nikola Tesla and Marconi were experimenting with radio waves, and that kind of blew the door wide open, because both of them were actually very interested in extraterrestrials and wrote a lot about how, at this point they were literally like flashing one letter across the English Channel, but they were already thinking, how can we use this to communicate with aliens on Mars? And Tesla actually thought he heard from aliens. Like he was starting to go kind of crazy at that point, but he thought they had sent him a message. But around that time, Marconi spent a lot of time on boats doing experiments, and like no one knew what he was up to. He just like got into the ocean with a giant radio receiver, and no one would hear from him for weeks. And so the New York Times started floating a story around, like truly the origin of fake news. They're like, yeah, Marconi's messaging Mars, and he's like heard from an alien. He's out there on the ocean talking to them. And he never like confirmed or denied this, and like I respect the hell out of him for this. He was just kind of like, yeah, like maybe I am, maybe I'm not, and like he just kind of let it happen. And so for about 20 years, Marconi and Tesla were just trying to figure out how to talk to people on Mars, and that probably would have been the end of SETI, because like no one was really doing anything that serious. No one was like thinking about like actual communication schemes. They're just like, we could do it, but no one will give us money to talk to the Martians. And then everything kind of changed in 1932. A scientist working at Bell Labs named Carl Jansky, he was the first to observe radio emissions from the Milky Way galaxy. And so he, like, just on accident, and he created the entire field of radio astronomy. And it didn't take people very long to realize, because at this point, like, everyone kind of knew there weren't anyone on Mars. So he blew the door open for modern SETI, and like now no longer was it just looking for aliens on planets. We could look anywhere in the universe, and with radio we could conceivably talk to them. And so at that point people really started taking this idea seriously of how to actually establish, like not only establish communication in terms of using radio waves, but how do you encode information in that, which is a really, really tricky problem. So it took about 20 years, but then the man I had mentioned earlier, Hans Freudenthal, was kind of the first to sit down and try to crack that nut with a language and just, send the ball rolling down the hill. So that's the history of SETI in brief. Yes.
So some of those really early examples that you gave with like the trees and the fires in the desert, which are so metal, and I love them, but they were focused on, you're just sending a signal, you're sending something out into nothing. You're not trying to hear anything back.
Right, yeah, and I think it's also important, all these early designs, they were iconic, and so an icon versus a symbol, an icon directly represents the thing. So if you say drew a picture of a tree and that represents tree, that's different than writing the word tree, which would be a symbolic representation of a tree. So all the early schemes to communicate with extraterrestrials were all iconic, writing a triangle bounded by squares in this Siberian tundra. That's an iconic representation of the Pythagorean theorem. But to your point, around the middle of the 20th century, SETI kind of took a symbolic turn, and they were like, okay, we're going to figure out how to teach aliens an actual bona fide language, a symbolic language, and that opens up the door. No longer are you limited to communicating very basic facts. You can communicate a massive amount of information. The trouble is, if you if any of you have ever traveled abroad in a country where you don't speak the language and you look at a sign, you can probably recognize the characters, individual characters, and in some cases it's even hard to do that. But Cyrillic, for example, if you were in Russia, it can be very hard to understand what a word means. There's really no easy translation as opposed to Spanish. Even if you don't speak Spanish but you speak English, you can maybe tease out some of the meaning because of the common roots. So if you think about that, but then in an extraterrestrial context, it gets even harder because these intelligent beings on the receiving end have literally no context whatsoever. They probably don't even share that much of your biology. So how on earth do you go from a symbol to meaning? And that's really the ultimate problem with communicating with extraterrestrials, and what actually a lot of this book is about is exploring the different ways to connect symbols to reality. And it's just, I think, a really fascinating issue.
And there was kind of a debate in the early days of that, right, where people were like, should we contact, if there's something else out there, should we try to contact it? Because what if it wants to come and kill us?
Oh yeah, I mean that debate is still very much alive today. A lot of people involved with SETI think it's a terrible idea because aliens might come and eat us or something. I think for what it's worth, I think there is a lot of reasons not to broadcast messages. Danger is not one of them. But yeah, actually, when Marconi when the New York Times was floating all these rumors that he was talking to Martians on the ocean, this one guy wrote an op-ed, and it's just it's a great read. I would recommend reading the thing in its entirety because he just goes on and on and on about how aliens, they're going to send us math and just ruin everything for us, and nothing's going to be fun anymore because they'll have spoiled learning basically, and just he was pissed. And
the danger was he was going to send us math, or the aliens were going to send us
math?
Yeah,
they're we have to discover this on our own, or else it's just why do it? And yeah, and so that kind of got it started. But then when Frank Drake and Carl Sagan broadcast the Arecibo message in the 1970s, this guy named Sir Martin Ryle, who was the lead astronomer at the Royal Academy, he wrote a letter after that and was just livid and was like, "This is such a terrible idea." And he was definitely thinking about the dangers of extraterrestrial contact. He's like, "What if they're malevolent? What if they come and kill us?" And yeah, I suppose what if, but also, what a pessimistic view, I think, honestly, of it says a lot about how you view people, I think, how you talk about extraterrestrials.
Yeah, you mentioned Sagan, and this kind of leads into a theme that runs throughout your book, which is that when we make these efforts to communicate with aliens, they say more about us as humans than it does about anything that we're ever going to hear back. So talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's maybe one of the more hopeful and least pessimistic views of science and linguistics and speaking to extraterrestrials in general, is that we can learn something about ourselves by trying. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that's also kind of one of the reasons why I think the expert comment on the back about hopefully this will be relevant one day is funny, because I think it's relevant right now. A lot of people, it's easy to dismiss SETI and interstellar communication as just, there's so many problems in the world. Why on earth would we focus on this one? And I think that's somewhat of a valid critique if we're talking about actually sending messages and like using radio telescopes. It's like, I think that's a waste of our time. We should spend it listening. But I think if we're talking about the act of thinking about how to design a message and what to include in it, that's actually an incredibly valuable thing to do right now, and we should be spending more time and effort doing it. And the reason I think that is because when we think about interstellar communication between two species, or I guess I'll back up a little bit. Like when you and I communicate on Earth, it's a conversation between two individuals. And like when our president talks to Erdogan or someone, if he were to do something like that, he like is talking on behalf of a nation. But if we're talking about interstellar communication, we're talking about a conversation between two species that occupy an entire planet. And our species is so diverse. How on earth do you go about crafting a message that can encapsulate what it means to be human when there's such a wide variety of humans on Earth? Like who speaks for Earth? And I think that's a very tough problem, but I don't think it's necessarily an impossible one to answer. And I think by framing it in the context of interstellar messaging, it forces us to look for commonalities between nations and cultures and individuals. And so there's, I think, a very strong unifying force. And it's, aside from that, encouraging people to think about planetary level issues on this scale, because you also need to think about what are we going to include. Like when we talk to ETI and describe ourselves, are we also going to talk about all the wars and the fact that like this massive wealth disparity in our country? Do we include that information, or do we just like say everything's cool here, guys, like we got it, like planet's fine? And if you have to think about, well, if we contact ETI and we say we're destroying our planet and we're not even sure if we're going to make it another few generations, like if you got that message, do you want to talk to these people? Like what do they have to offer you, really? So you could sugarcoat that, or you could say, wow, like this is a great way to think about these problems and think about what really makes us human and like what is really important to everybody, not just to you and your individual circumstance. And so I think when you think about interstellar message in that context, there's a lot of value in trying to craft this aside from like the science and the mathematics and all the kind of interesting technical stuff. So yeah, I think we should be doing more to do this. And this is something that Carl Sagan actually recognized very well when they sent out the Voyager records in the 70s. I think the first one of those just reached interstellar space not too long ago. It's the first craft to ever cross the heliosphere. And there's no way an alien is ever going to find this thing. Like that is, it's never going to happen. And Carl Sagan was a pretty smart guy. I think he recognized that, and so did Frank Drake and his fellow designers. But they also recognized that wasn't the point. The point was like to create an object for humanity itself to rally around and really like look out to the cosmos and like think about things that are larger than ourselves. And so, to me, at this point in history, until we hear from an extraterrestrial, I think that's by far the most valuable portion of, thinking about extraterrestrial languages.
So I think we're going to open it up to probably questions in a moment. So just start thinking about those, and I'm going to ask a few more.
Okay. I got answers.
So I guess I want to talk more about just the process of writing this book, because you've spent the last 2 years doing it, and I'm sure you didn't expect it to be what it was. So I want to hear more about just kind of that process and like the experience of writing a book of this scale and technical level while also holding down like several full-time jobs and side gigs and sometimes maintaining a social life. And just the effort that goes into being commissioned by MIT to write a book, basically.
Yeah, so when MIT reached out to me to do this is my first book, and so I was like, oh yeah, like give me 6 months and I'll have it for you. It'll be like no problem. I know a lot about aliens. And it turns out I knew nothing about aliens, and also like I'm not a mathematician. I studied philosophy and creative writing in school, and so if you look at the appendix of this book, it's like it's like I had to learn a lot of really technical stuff, and so like, yeah, it is a lot of math. The book itself, I promise, is interesting, but the appendix, it's a lot of math. And like actually, the first copy I turned in, they're like, you got to put all the math in the back. Like people don't want to numbers scare people, and I agree that they're like it's terrifying. But so like the first like probably year of this process was just like teaching myself about things like the lambda calculus and like the calculus of construction with induction and like all these really boring sounding things that like now I think are fascinating, but at the time it's just like, man, this is I'm not going to use strong language here, but it was boring. And yeah, it was a lot of time indoors during the summer when you'd rather be outside, hanging out. But on the same time, there's a lot in here that really hasn't been captured in any other books about SETI. So it was a really fascinating process. I got to talk with a lot of experts who are currently working on this up in like Northern California. They spend their days literally walking around these telescopes. And if we hear from ET, they're going to be the guys that are like getting that message and trying to figure out what's happening. And so that was kind of, I think, the most rewarding part of this book is really getting to speak with the individuals who are doing this, because it's a really thankless job. Like SETI, if you have $50,000 burning in your pocket, they could really use it. Like no one wants to fund this, our government especially. So, but I think, it's a long shot, but this could potentially be one of the most significant moments in all of human history is when we make first contact. And so these people are really selfless individuals who are thinking about this and working on this. And like a lot of the scientists and mathematicians, their full-time job isn't creating extraterrestrial languages. They do this because they're passionate about it and think it's important. And so getting to get to know these people who are doing this in a professional manner was really just incredible.
Is there any one like individual or circumstance during the writing of this book that like really sticks with you now?
Yeah, I mean, so the two men who designed the language that's on the cover, it's actually an untitled language, which I think is interesting because it's by far been broadcast more than any others. One of them actually passed away while I was writing this book, but I'd had the chance to talk to him prior to that. His name was Stéphane Dumas, and he's just brilliant and like really dedicated to SETI. So he and his colleague Yvonne Dutil had a really big impact on me, and they've been like amazingly helpful and like very patient with my dumb questions. So actually, yeah, everyone who's named in the acknowledgments are just like amazing scientists and people, and very, very, very patient. So, yeah.
So I think if anyone in the audience has any questions, now is maybe the time.
So
Rachel.
just wait for the microphone, just to make my life easy. But
you mentioned that you think there are a lot of good reasons to not broadcast, but danger isn't one of them. Could you expand on what your reasoning is to not broadcast?
Yeah, so this is actually like kind of the topic of the last chapter of the book, and it's a really active debate in SETI right now, which is should we or shouldn't we spend our time and money broadcasting messages as opposed to just listening for them. So as Sam had mentioned, a lot of people are really concerned about the danger. I think that like on the scale of things that you should be worried about right now, that is very low on that list, or at least it should be. But a lot of people who are involved in this don't think so, and they're right. I personally think the reason we shouldn't be broadcasting is because if like you can only see like maybe 50 stars in New York on like the best possible night, and like that would be an immense amount of work to target each one of those stars and create a message, and like the probability that one of those has intelligent life is very low. And then when you think about that, but in terms of billions of stars, the odds of just like picking the one that has intelligent life, minuscule, but the amount of energy and time it takes to broadcast a message is huge compared to listening. So my argument is really just from like a purely resource point of view. It makes very little sense to target any one particular star versus any other at this point.
Because like you said, they're like the government's not funding this massively.
Yeah, it's all private donations at this point. And billionaires are interested, which is nice, but not enough of them. Yeah, always nice. Yeah, if there's any billionaires listening, I will also take some. Yeah.
Well, like follow up to that, like don't you think that an intelligent extraterrestrial species might be thinking about the exact same problem and figuring it's not worth it because there are just too many other stars?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is kind of the profound paradox within SETI. And so I think if we are going to broadcast, what we should do is probably not broadcast anything with information content, but rather spend our time and resources creating a beacon. So it would just be like a simple either laser flash or radio wave that would just be constant. So as the Earth turned, it would kind of blanket the universe in. There would be no information, but it would let someone know we're out there, and then that might be able to facilitate. Problem with that is SETI has done a really good job of scanning the stars close to us. So if we do make contact at this point, chances are it's going to be at least like 100 light years away, and that would be like a best case scenario. So that means 200 years back and forth conversation, which creates its own problem, as it turns out, for message design, because then you need to think about how to capture everything in the message, because we do nothing on a generational scale at this point. I think we should, but to try to think about, like, yes, let's design a message that will not only make sense to ETI, but will also make sense to our ancestors in 5,000 years when they get a reply, is just like what a problem to try to tackle. Yeah.
I wanted to.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about. Sam brought up Voyager 1 and 2 earlier about the message that we curated on the Golden Record. There's a lot of weird stuff on that Golden Record. What if aliens find it?
Did everybody hear that?
Yeah, I'll repeat it just for the camera. So what if aliens find all the weird stuff on the Voyager 2?
Can you explain what's on Voyager 1 and 2?
There's like whale sounds.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's hundreds of pictures. There's sounds of like jets. There's sounds of whales. There's sound. Yeah, Carl Sagan's wife, or actually it's Carl Sagan, I think, laughing. Yeah, he's on there laughing, and it's like really weird. There's like music in the background. It's like it's really creepy, actually. Yeah, it's very unsettling. But yeah, I think so if aliens were to find that, it's actually kind of interesting. I think they did a really brilliant job in designing it as if someone were going to find it. So when you look at the record, there's like this like circle with a line coming out at the top and the bottom, and then some like dashes next to it, and those dashes represent binary, which is supposed to represent the number for the spin flip of a hydrogen atom, which is like, what does that even mean? And it's like the number of times a hydrogen atom transitions between energy levels. And hydrogen is it is the most abundant element in the universe. So the idea is, if aliens recognize that number in binary, that kind of serves as the key for the rest of the record. It'll tell you how fast the rotation rate is, how to extract information out of it, how to like actually interpret the things on it, all from this like one little tiny key. Will they understand it? I mean, it's a total conjecture, but I think it's a really elegant solution to the problem. My hope is that because it's a phonographic record, you could actually like study it at a microscopic level and see how the divots change, and know that there's information content on that based on the waveform of the divots in the record, which I think is also, it's sad that no one's probably ever going to find it. But
why do you think that?
It's just not sent towards any. I mean, like someone might find it in like 1 billion years, but for our intents and purposes, yeah, it's just
like chucked it out there, like.
Yeah, it was the definition of yeet. Yeah.
So do your scientists believe that aliens have never been to Earth?
I think it depends on who you ask. A lot of them will say no publicly. I don't know if I can name names, but I have talked to some who are at least open to the idea that aliens may have visited, but I think like the general sentiment is probably not. But there's a lot of unanswered mysteries out there, so I think a lot of them like to just kind of entertain the idea, like, what if?
Who's next?
Given that the universe is 13.6 billion years old, and we're such a new species, just blink of an eye, any alien species we talk to will probably be vastly more ancient than us. And how would that work with such an asymmetry of age and perhaps experience, wisdom, and technology, a conversation between these two partners?
I am very glad you asked, actually. That is, to our earlier point, that's actually a lot of the reasons why people are afraid of contact, because if you look at the history of Earth, if you have contact between asymmetrically advanced cultures, it's usually the least technologically sophisticated culture that gets wiped out. So, hopefully, there's a concept called the Great Filter within SETI, which is that technologically sophisticated civilization has to pass this threshold where they don't basically destroy themselves from their own intelligence. And that thinking kind of came about in this Cold War era mindset where we start to have these nuclear technologies, and for the first time in our history, we actually have the ability to more or less destroy our entire species. And that's really unique in our history. We've people died in wars, but we could literally just end it all tomorrow with a few pushes of a button. And so the idea is that to get to a certain point of technological advancement, you basically have to either have enough altruism within your species to get past that hurdle and figure your shit out, for lack of a better or more elegant term there. So I'm optimistic because I agree. I think if we do make contact, the odds are that these species are going to be far more advanced than our own. But my hope is that the only way you can get to that level of advancement is by learning to cooperate better as a species. So I would like to think, and I think there is a pretty strong logical argument to be made that any advanced civilization that is older than our own is hopefully also more altruistic and more inclined to cooperate. But in terms of, as far as communication goes, I think it also opens up an interesting question when you look at how Earth itself is advancing in terms of how we use technology. From my perspective, we seem to be advancing towards a post-biological kind of milieu where we increasingly integrate ourselves with machines. And so if that trajectory is also mimicked on other planets, we could probably expect that the ET we find is actually an ETAI, which is great from an interstellar messaging perspective because it opens up a lot of really interesting ways to frame messages, which we don't have too much time, so I won't go into here, but I do go into a lot in the book. I think artificial intelligence really might hold the key to understanding how we communicate with extraterrestrials precisely for that reason.
When you were talking about how we can't, it's very difficult to think outside our own biology to think about what these languages could be like. I was thinking about Star Trek and the Universal Translator and how a lot of science fiction just kind of moves around this problem because it's just too difficult to deal with, which I had never really thought about before until you said that. Can you talk a little more about, I don't know, just what we have figured out so far? How do you even start to think outside of what you know?
Yeah, so I am not a huge Trekkie, as Robin can attest to, but one of the few episodes I've seen is the one where, the translator one. I think it's such a beautiful episode. So I guess in terms of how do you think about communicating with something very unlike yourself? And I don't want to give away too much here because I think it's one of my favorite parts of this book is early SETI history is they were obsessed with dolphins, and I'm not going to go into why. You're going to have to read and figure that out. But they fucking love dolphins, and dolphins are really interesting because they have these massively complex brains, and the more animal communication researchers study them, they also seem to demonstrate a lot of hallmarks of human language within their own communication system. They have displaced reference, they can seem to produce novel utterances and all this. And so early SETI researchers were really looking at non-human animals on Earth who seem to have complex communication systems as kind of prototypical aliens, which, as I go into in the book, is, I think, kind of a flawed research direction because what Noam Chomsky and other linguists of his ilk have demonstrated is that human language, its primary function isn't communication. They argue it's actually to order our thoughts. And communication and the hallmarks of speaking, I'm speaking to you now and it's linear, but that is actually not representative or definitive of language as such. Language is actually, they think, defined by its hierarchical recursive structure. And as far as we know, no animal on Earth demonstrates that. And so even these really smart non-human primates that appear to be able to string symbols together and create novel sentences, that's not really language, is what Chomsky's arguing. He actually wrote a great book a couple of years ago called Why Only Us, if you're interested in it. It's just fascinating. But so basically, I think for the first 40 years of SETI, they're yeah, we need to figure out how to talk to intelligent animals on Earth, and that'll give us an idea of how to talk to aliens. But my personal thesis that I kind of go into more in the book is that babies are aliens. Like this is, I will die on this hill, babies are aliens, tell everyone you know. And the reason I think this is because we need to start thinking about how humans acquire language as children. Because when you think about it, it's just amazing that like this thing that has hardly any knowledge of the world and can learn any language on Earth, and every human does it, and it doesn't matter what language it is. And in fact, they can learn multiple languages, and at a very young age, and only from a handful of examples. And like that is incredible, and that's also kind of the reason why they think language is strongly rooted in our biology. So yeah, that doesn't really answer your question, because I don't think there is an answer. Like it's all going to be conjecture until we make contact, but we can kind of experiment with how we learn a language on Earth and assume that aliens are going to be like us, which sounds like a far-fetched claim, but one of the chapters in the book is about why I think aliens are actually going to be very, very similar to us, which is, huh? Yes, yes. One episode. Yeah.
Not enough.
Yes, I love the trek.
I think we have time for one or two more quick questions.
Hey. So snowballing off your comments about ET/AI, I wanted to hear your thoughts, since it's such a hot topic right now, about human-created AI, and if you think there's possibilities that we should be exploring ways to communicate with aliens by using AI, by sending out our own signals, and if you're optimistic about AI as a tool for humanity or pessimistic, a la Elon Musk, etc.
So I think, like to the first part of that question, I think AI will be incredibly useful in terms of interstellar messages. I think if we could send computer programs, there's a lot of hope to be had in that. Is like if you can send out an artificially intelligent program with instructions for how to operate it, that could be a really great way to send a lot of information in a relatively energy efficient way. And as far as AI on Earth, I mean, I think Elon Musk is a fearmonger and like is like getting way ahead of himself here. If you look around at like the state of machine learning, like maybe I'll eat my words in 10 years, and like I hope I do, because I would love to see AGI, but like I think we're so far away. Yeah. Elon Musk, if you're listening, I think you're full of it. But yeah, no, I'm optimistic, and there's a lot of downsides, and like Sam's whole beat is covering like the downsides of machine learning and all these nefarious ways that it can be used, and that's just like one slice of that. But I think I ultimately have faith in humans, and like I think we're still designing these things, and they'll reflect our worst tendencies, but also our best. And I don't know how much time we have, but that might be a good place to. Okay.
I was wondering, are there any human languages or writing systems that are particularly unique and almost alien, and are they studied for insights about how strange language might get?
Yeah, and that's a great place to end. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Linear B, but it's this ancient undeciphered language. We're not really sure where it comes from. People have made guesses, but every time someone cracks Linear B, put on your skeptic hat, because they probably did not. It's been cracked like 20 times, and it still hasn't. But I think the important point to that is that when we think about communicating with aliens, it's less like an exercise in translation and more like trying to decipher an ancient lost language. And that to me is probably the most visceral way to put into context the problem at hand. Like when you think about the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, that entire civilization almost got lost to us if it wasn't for the Rosetta Stone. Like we would have probably never understood like this amazing culture that had a really rich written record, were it not for that piece of translation that put it into a modern language. And so I try to think about communicating with ET as imagine that you were just thrust into Egypt and they're like, look at this writing on the wall and figure it out. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. That's what they're going to receive from us, is just like, here's really just a bunch of numbers. It's going to be modulated radio waves. What do these mean? And then, yeah, hopefully you can figure out a way to bring that down to reality. And that's really the tricky part, is making that jump from, just a wave moving across the screen or some, binary numbers to a really meaningful interaction. I don't think we figured it out yet, but there's a lot of interesting work.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you
all for being
Thank
here.
you all. Yeah.
I think we're going to do a book signing